Hey everyone, my name is Adam. It's really cool to be here at Dev World X World. It's been a really long time since I've been here. I used to live relatively close in Perth, but now I live very far away, so I don't get here as much as I would like, but it's awesome to be back. I'm an iOS developer. I've been an iOS developer for a very, very, very long time. I do apps on my own under the banner Kabuki Vision. I also have done lots of apps for various companies over the years, and now my day job is at Bonobo Labs. We do the Moleskine Studio suite of apps, TimePage, Actions, and Pro. And Flow. I called it Pro, man. Is it too late to back out of this? Anyway. I love iOS app development. I love it, I love it, I love it. And the only thing I love more than iOS app development is going endlessly on nostalgic stories about the history of iOS app development. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I know some of you have been iOS developers for a long time, and so this will be some fun nostalgia. Maybe some others are newer to it or maybe aren't developers at all, in which case hopefully it'll be some interesting insight into the world of the good old days of how things used to be. So I have a lot to talk about. I'm going to go pretty fast, so let's get started. We'll begin in the Stone Age of iOS app development, also known as the year 2007. In early 2007, January, Apple announced the iPhone, the very first iPhone. It was not released, however, until June, and during that period of time, we all wondered, well, what's going to be the story for developers? Are people going to be able to make apps for this cool new device? Luckily, at WWDC that same year, Steve Jobs got on stage and he told us, yes, we do want developers to be able to have apps on the iPhone, and we have a very sweet solution for developers. And that sweet solution is web apps in Safari. This is not what we wanted, right? I mean, web apps are fine, but we wanted, ooh, native apps, real apps. And so, you know, a little bit of grumpy nerds out there. Luckily, just a few months later, Steve Jobs made a statement saying, okay, yes, we do want native apps, and we're going to announce a real native SDK early next year. But before we get to that, it's important to point out that even before we had a real official native SDK, there were some very smart Apple nerds out there who figured out how to jailbreak existing iPhones so they could install whatever they wanted on it, figured out how to build tool chains so they could build apps, and figured out how to figured out the APIs needed to actually create apps. So if you had a jailbroken phone, even before there was an official app store, there were several noteworthy apps out there that you could download. But moving on to the real deal, as promised, in early 2008, Apple had a very special event where they announced the native SDK. Scott Forstall was the VP of all things iPhone at the time, and he told us all about it. He told us that this SDK is going to be the same APIs that Apple uses for their own apps, which, you know, mostly true, probably. He told us about iPhone OS. Yes, iPhone OS, not iOS. That's what it was called at the time. I think this might have been the first time they even gave it a name at all, because before this, there was really no reason to it. He told us that the frameworks for iPhone OS were going to be similar to the Mac frameworks, except for the UI layer. On the Mac, we had AppKit. On iPhone, it was going to be UIKit, a whole nother layer for the multi-touch and all of that. He told us about the tools, familiar tools, Xcode, Interface Builder, Instruments, and iPhone Simulator, all of which we still use today. And then right there live on stage, he created a Hello World app. What else do you do when you have a new set of APIs, right? Right there in Xcode, and he ran it on his phone. And then to wrap things up, he invited some developers on stage who had secretly been given access to the SDK a few weeks before that to kind of show what they were able to do in a couple weeks, just to maybe get us more excited and motivated. But then they brought out the big guns. Steve Jobs got on stage and he told us about the App Store. Up to this point, we had no idea there was going to be an App Store. It wasn't even something that was rumored, I don't think. He showed us some, I think it's probably a mock-up of what it looked like. And then he told us this was going to be the exclusive way to distribute apps on the iPhone. And there's some important context here, right? Back then, of course, we had personal computers just like today. And personal computers, you could install software from any source, right? You could go to a store and get it in a box. You could download it from the internet. You could write your own apps. But at the same time, there were existing devices that were sort of non-computer devices, right? Like mobile phones, video game consoles, even Apple's own iPod, all had some degree of third-party apps and games. So at the time, it may seem strange now, but at the time there was really no default assumption about how the iPhone situation was going to work. I mean, Apple's a computer company, so maybe we assumed it's probably going to be more like a computer. But you know, they also made the iPod, so this was not a highly controversial revelation at the time, at least for most people. He then told us about the famous 70-30 split and the business model, and he said, this is the best deal going to distribute applications to mobile platforms. And I believe, certainly at the time, that was more or less very true. And then he told us that there were going to be limitations in the App Store, that they were not going to accept any type of app. Certain types of apps would not be acceptable. I find this slide fascinating because I believe it's the only time that the word porn has appeared on an official Apple slide and an official presentation. Like, that just kind of blows my mind. And then in typical Apple fashion, he said, oh yeah, the SDK is available for free today in about an hour. The kind of surprise ending. Although there was one more surprise ending. This venture capital firm, Kleiner Perkins Caufield and Byers, glad I said that right, announced the iFund, this $100 million fund specifically for developers who wanted to build iPhone apps. And I think this is really interesting because I think it shows the lack of certainty around the App Store. It was not assumed that this was going to be some big explosive thing, and I think this was Apple's way of kind of trying to encourage us to get excited about building apps. But they didn't have to, really, because we all were excited. And so we all went to download that SDK that same day, and we went to the iPhone Developer Center. And yes, this is actually what it looked like. And we downloaded the SDK, which came with Xcode 3.1. Yeah, Xcode already existed. It was the tool to build Mac apps. So 3.1 was the first version that you could build iPhone apps with. This is actually what it looked like, and that's a real sample iPhone app right there in good old Objective-C. Yes, Objective-C, Objective-C. It was the one, the true, the only programming language for building iOS apps. At the time, people that were already building Mac apps were used to it because it was the same for the Mac. But for those of us new to the community, it was kind of this strange new syntax with the weird square brackets. But you know what? We were excited. We used it. We liked it. At least I liked it. I still kind of like it. Interface Builder also came with the SDK. Yes, that's right. Interface Builder was a separate app. It was not built into Xcode like it is today. That didn't happen until Xcode 4.0 a few years later. And even this version of Interface Builder didn't come until the third beta of the first SDK. So if you were someone who downloaded the SDK the very first day it was available, for those first few weeks, you were doing all of your interface work in code. The first SDK came with only 18 frameworks. This is all of them. Such a small number, it all fits only on one slide. Any guesses as to how many frameworks come with the SDK now? Anyone? 50? 100? Well, let me shrink it down a bit so they'll all fit. There's 188 frameworks today as of iOS 17. And there's several popular ones that you'll recognize that were not part of the original SDK. So I think today, if you were to build a brand new app, you would almost certainly use a good number of those. But back then, we had to do without. Same with UIKit. UIKit, only 40 public classes. That's the entirety of UIKit, which again was the UI framework that we used. And while I was making those last two slides, it kind of occurred to me that I remember those first few years, it was actually possible to know everything about iOS development. Like, you really could know what every single thing in UIKit did, and maybe you didn't use every framework, but you knew roughly what they did. And if you thought of a new app, you would know, like, oh, that is possible, and here's the frameworks I could use. And I kind of miss that, of course, over the years. We have so many new APIs, so many frameworks, which is great. It's awesome. We could do so many more things, but we've lost a little bit of that, internalizing, feeling like I know everything. How did we learn to make apps? Well, again, the iPhone Developer Center had a lot of information. We had lots of sample code, lots of really good documentation, actually. And one of the reasons this kind of in the early days was the main place to learn things was that the entire SDK was under NDA back then. We were not officially supposed to talk about it publicly. Of course, people did a little bit, but I think people were a little reluctant to make their discussions too public. There were still some public places. There were various forums. I specifically remember the Mac Rumors forum, which has a Apple developer sub-forum, which was very popular discussions about building iOS apps in those early days. In fact, if you're motivated, you can go to the Mac Rumors forums today and do a search. They have an archive of everything. So you want to search for that early 2008 era, and you can see what real developers were actually talking about around the SDK and what they wanted to build and helping each other out. There were some tutorial sites, but maybe just one or two. You know, nowadays you can't leave your house without accidentally tripping over a new Swift tutorial site. But back then, very few. And of course, there were some developer blogs, just ad hoc posts about things, but you know, not a ton of information. While the SDK was free, if you wanted to actually run an app on your actual hardware or submit to the App Store, you did have to join the developer program, $99, which of course we all wanted to do because we all wanted to run apps on our device. But back then, there was a bit of a backlog. I think Apple was approving things manually, and a lot of us, myself included, got an email basically saying, hey, we're processing things as fast as we can, you know, hold tight. And so, you know, we did. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, we've talked a lot about how we learned about stuff. How did we actually, you know, build apps? What was it like to actually make apps? And I'm an optimist, so I'm going to only focus on the most annoying things. I have a little special segment called Annoying Things We Used to Have to Deal With, But Don't Anymore. First off, limited memory. Man, those early iPhones had a tiny little bit of memory. It was really sad. The first two, only 128 megabytes of RAM. And guess what? If your app used up all the memory, the system just killed your app. It gave you a little bit of warning first. It would call one of these functions. And unlike now, you were actually expected to really implement that and try to free up memory any way that you could. I think we're still supposed to do it now, but you know, memory's plentiful. Who cares? Speaking of memory, manual memory management, manual reference counting in Objective-C, which meant that if you allocated an object and used it, you had to release it, call release on it to tell the system that it might be available to be freed up. It was annoying. It wasn't the worst thing in the world. A few years later, Apple introduced automatic reference counting into the Xcode compiler. And of course, Swift has that built into it too, so we don't have to worry about it anymore, but kind of annoying. This is the worst of the worst. Signing certificates and provisioning profiles. 100% manual process. Xcode does so much of this for you now, but back then, if you just simply had a brand new phone and you wanted to hook it up to your Mac and start running apps on it, you had to grab the UUID and upload it to the portal and download the new provisioning profile and install it into Xcode, and it was a huge mess. Very, very, very annoying. And then in terms of like UI stuff, believe it or not, things like grid layouts. We didn't have UICollectionView. Doing something like this was kind of annoying. Rich text. We didn't have attributed strings. You know, you had to kind of hack your way into doing these things. These are things that are now very simple, but were very annoying at the past. And of course, while we were doing all these annoying things, we were doing it walking uphill in the snow like a bunch of grumpy old men. Back to the main timeline. There were 8 betas. Beta 1 through Beta 8, they were called, believe it or not. And Beta 8, I think, went through June of that first year, 2008, which takes us to WWDC. The first one to sell out was 2008. It still took several months to sell out, so it's not like the more recent sellout ones. It was also the first WWDC to have any iPhone sessions. Maybe that's why it sold out. Apple gave us some statistics at that event. 250,000 people downloaded the SDK at that time. 25,000 had applied to the beta program, but only 4,000 actually were admitted because of that backlog I told you about. I think I was one of them. I don't think I got admitted until like a month after this. Another interesting thing, push notifications were not part of the original SDK, but at this WWDC, Apple announced it as a new feature that would be released in a few months. They kind of pitched it actually as kind of a way of working around the lack of multitasking, right? If you have a messaging app and you want it to alert you when you get a new message, well, they can't let apps just run freely in the background, and so push notifications was a solution for that. They told us it was going to be released later that year in September, but this turned out to be a lie. More on that later. They told us about iPhone OS 2.0, kind of formally announced as going to be available to the public, along with their new second phone, the iPhone 3G, and that both of these would be available July 11th. And this was important because for developers, this gave us the target date, finally, of when the App Store was going to be available. And if you wanted to be available, you wanted your app to be on the store day one, which you probably did. Now you knew how fast you had to work. And let's talk about that. The first year of the App Store, what was it like for developers? Day one, there were 500 apps, which at the time seemed like a really big number, big, you know, look at all those apps. But now that's kind of pitiful. That's what the App Store actually looked like. After 2 weeks, they had 10 million app downloads, not too bad. One of the ways you got your app noticed back then was on this new chart under the featured section. This was a very prominent placement, believe it or not. Just the act of releasing a new app put you to the top of the chart, and then as new apps came in, you get bumped down, but there weren't that many new apps each day, and so it was a pretty prominent placement. And this was back when users were really excited about apps, and people would check the App Store every day for, you know, new apps. And so this was a good way of getting a good head start on downloads early on. You could also get noticed by getting written about in the press, which of course is still true today, but it was really, I think it was a different world back then. Like, this was this bubble of time which just everyone was excited about apps. People were talking about, ooh, what new app should I try? Ooh, let me show you this new app. People were talking about it, and the press, of course, wanted to write about it. You know, what are the weekly top apps of the week, the best apps in a category? It was just this, you know, Apple had that marketing thing. There's an app for that. You know, it just talking about like apps was a really big deal during this time. Back to the App Store, there was another prominent placement, the top charts, which I think, do we still have that in the App Store today? I think so. No one really cares as much. But this was a big deal back then. Again, a prominent placement. People were checking the App Store all the time to see what's, you know, what are the cool apps everyone's talking about. There was a chart for top paid apps and top free apps. This was based on downloads. And this would be a good time for me to transition to another special segment I'm going to call A Brief History of App Store Business Models. Yes, you didn't think you wanted this, but trust me, you do. Back in the beginning, your app only could be a paid upfront app or a free app. The world was simple. No in-app purchase, no freemium, no subscriptions, you know, very, very, very simple. If you had a paid app, especially in the very early days, you might have a price point like $5, $10, maybe $20. That was not crazy, but that quickly changed because developers started to think about ways of gaming the charts. And one strategy people figured out was, hey, if I make my price cheaper, I'll get more downloads. And if I get more downloads, I'll get higher up in the charts, and then I'll get more prominence, which will lead to more downloads, etc. And thus began the great race to the bottom, as we called it. And pretty over that first year, prices all kind of settled down at around 99 cents. Another even more clever way to game the charts, if you had a paid app, you would make it free for a few days. And guess what? When it was free, a huge spike in downloads. Everyone's excited. Oh, check it out for free. And then you'd switch it back to paid. And guess what? That huge spike of downloads would count towards your placement on the paid charts now. So you'd have this artificial bump, you know, by doing this, which only lasted a short period of time. Apple figured it out and put a stop to it. I couldn't go through the talk. Speaking of gaming the system, I see many people recognize this. There was an infamous app during this time period called I Am Rich. And this app was a paid upfront app that was set to the highest price point, $999 US. And all it did was show that picture in the screenshot, this little red gem. I think there was also like a text inspirational mantra. And the whole gimmick was, you know, I am rich enough to spend $1,000 on a pointless app. And so obviously you can imagine it had a lot of infamy, a lot of press. None of us downloaded it because, you know, we're not rich. Apple eventually pulled it from the store. My understanding is the developer actually sold 8 copies and only had 2 refunds. So still, you know, $6,000 for what I hope was just a day's work. If you had a free app, doesn't mean you couldn't make money, because the era of mobile ads exploded almost immediately after the App Store was available. There were various companies like AdWorld, which actually were the first ones to have real native SDKs. You could just drop in and show ads. AdWorld got bought by AdMob pretty soon, which you've probably heard of, and AdMob got bought by Google, which I know you've heard of. In between the world of free and paid was this thing that happened called light versions of apps. If you had a paid app, it was hard to get people to try your app, right? Because it was paid. So you had a second version of app called the light version, which was free and was limited in some way. And the idea was that people would try the free version and they hit the limits, and then you'd upsell them to the paid version. The word light was used very commonly because Apple got grumpy if you called it a demo or trial, because those implied some sort of expiration or limited, some sort of limits. And of course, we don't see this anymore because in-app purchase does the same thing, really. That was kind of freemium before there was freemium, I guess. Speaking of in-app purchase was added to the OS. I'm going to keep saying iOS. iPhone OS. It's much harder to say. I'm glad they changed it. iPhone OS 3.0, they added in-app purchase. A lot of people don't remember this, though, is that initially in-app purchase was for paid apps only. Free apps were not allowed to implement in-app purchase. Apple's logic was to make it simpler and prevent confusion. They wanted like free apps remain free. This only lasted a few months, though, actually, because later in October that same year, they just decided, oh yeah, free apps can do in-app purchase too, and thus exploded the entire new business model of freemium and all the related things that have pretty much taken over the whole way you make money in the App Store today. I think today paid up, I mean, people still do paid up front apps, but it's much more of a rare novelty, let's say. Let's see, subscriptions were introduced in 2011, but it's not the subscriptions you're thinking of. This is a very limited form of subscriptions that were only for certain types of apps, content-based apps like magazines or newspapers. The idea was that you're subscribing to the content, not the actual app. So most of us weren't making those kind of apps, so we knew about it, but we didn't really think about it too much. Until 2016, that is, when Apple introduced subscriptions for all type of apps. I think this is the first time they altered the 70-30 split. It was 85-15 after the first year, and it was also the first time there was any real way for developers, or I should say non-awkward way for developers to do any sort of like time-based trial. And that was back in 2016, and not much has happened actually since then, unless of course you count early this year in the European Union, in which case everything has changed and up is down and down is up. And maybe in 10 years I'll do a history talk where we talk about how that affected everything. But yeah, that's for a future talk. Before I wrap up this section, I want to talk about paid upgrades, which is a business model that Apple has never officially supported. By paid upgrades, I mean, in the world of desktop computers, you buy an app and you can pay an upgrade fee to go to the 3.0, 4.0 version, etc. This has never been officially supported because updates are always free on iOS. But over the years, companies have tried to do their own ad hoc version of this by releasing an entirely separate app for each major version. That never really panned out. It kind of either made consumers somewhere between grumpy and confused, and once we had auto-renewing subscriptions, most people used that for recurring revenue. Back to the main timeline we go. In early 2009, iPhone OS 3.0 was announced. It included in-app purchase, store kit, like we talked about, map kit. I keep forgetting map kit was not in the original SDK. Push notifications were delayed from that September, but they did end up in iPhone OS 3.0. Core data, have to call out the core data. I love it. Apple gave us some stats about the App Store and the app review process. They told us 96% of apps submitted are approved. Cool. 98% of apps approved in 7 days or less. Wait, what, 7 days? They're bragging about that? What's going on? Well, it turns out that that was actually the common review time. And that's a good time to transition to another special segment I like to call A Brief History of App Store Review and Guidelines. This is the fun one. Yes, back then, 7 days was the average review time. You submit your app, wait 7 days, hope for the best. And it was also very inconsistent. Sometimes you get lucky, 3 days, wow, what happened? Other times unlucky, 14 days, 20 days. Like, why? Who knows, right? What about App Store Review Guidelines? Well, guess what? There were no App Store Review Guidelines, or at least there was no official document that we, like today, that we call the App Store Review Guidelines. There were some rules in the legal developer agreement that we all signed that told us certain types of apps we could or could not make, but that whole thing was under NDA, so we couldn't even really talk about it. It's very annoying. We did have the human interface guidelines, which helped us know what kind of interfaces were suggested. But otherwise, it was largely guesswork and luck. And I know a lot of you are going to be saying, but Adam, it's guesswork and luck now. Why is this any different? No, trust me, it was so bad before. You have no idea. Even back in 2008, App Store rejections were, highly publicized App Store rejections were a thing even back then. We see that a lot today, but even that first year, people were kind of, but in this case, they were actually just confused as to like, why was I rejected? What kind of rule did this violate? There was a lot of that's when the grumpiness around App Store rejections kind of started to bubble up. And in 2010, Apple did release the official App Store review guidelines, which improved things immensely. The much more detailed guidelines, still vague in some ways because, Apple, but much better. And this was the first time there was a mechanism to appeal your rejections to a review board. Before that, if you got rejected, you would just look up at the sky and kind of wonder what's going on and maybe try to do something and resubmit and hope for the best. The next big change, though, was when Phil Schiller rode into town and took over all things related to the App Store. And the first big change he made, which was awesome, was improved app review times. They went down immediately to like a day or two, which is kind of where we're at now. Although sometimes they're like hours. It's crazy sometimes now. The other thing around this time is he kind of revamped all of the app review guidelines, and as part of that, or I guess to celebrate this, Apple did this interesting thing. They released the App Store review guidelines in the form of a comic book. They commissioned some artists to create comic book panels, but the actual, all the dialogue bubbles are just the literal text from the App Store review guidelines. And I really think you should check this out. It's still pretty easy to find the PDF today. Of course, the guidelines are out of date, so don't use the guidelines themselves. But it's a really cool, fun artifact of the time. Back to the timeline. I'll take a breath. 2010. The iPad was announced, and this is noteworthy because it was the second major device type that ran iPhone OS. Yes, still called iPhone OS at the time of the announcement, despite it being for the iPad. I'm not counting the iPod Touch when I say second major device. And this is kind of interesting because, we didn't know if iPhone OS was just for the iPhone, right? And of course, now we know they use it for everything, for the TV, for the Vision Pro, all this kind of stuff. So on this day of the announcement, we could download the SDK for this, but the actual device was not available till 60 days later. And this is the first time we had that experience of we get the announcement, we can download the SDK, we can build the app in the simulator, but we have to wait a period of time to get the actual hardware. And we get the actual hardware on the same day as the general public. So there's that last minute scramble at the end to make sure your apps are working on the actual hardware. Some developers that were concerned about how their apps might actually feel in their hand on the new iPad build these cardboard mock-ups of the iPad just to kind of see, like, oh, how's it going to feel to actually hold it? I don't know if people really do that stuff anymore. I didn't see any Vision Pro cardboard mock-ups. Maybe, maybe there were. Of course, if you had an iPhone app, you'd want to port it to the iPad, probably. Apple pushed a new mechanism called Universal Apps, where you have one app that you buy it once and you can install it on your iPhone or iPad. But you did have the option of having a separate iPad version, which in those first couple of years of the iPad, this was much more common. I think people wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to sell another version to their existing customer base. Oh yeah, and the reason I chose the Angry Birds, you see the HD, that was actually kind of one of the de facto designations for it being the iPad version, because you couldn't put the word iPad on your icon. And of course, you also have the option of not porting your iPhone app to iPad, and it would look like this. It's very sad. I'm still grumpy about the fact that Apple didn't let us opt out of that. That was just, to this day, if you have an iPhone-only app, you can run it on the iPad. They made improvements to how it works. Anyway. Speaking of iPads and new screen sizes, that's a very smooth segue, I know. Let's talk a little bit about a brief history of iOS screen sizes and layout. Back in the beginning, we had the iPhone, and we had one screen size. It was 320 pixels by 480 pixels tall. We were supposed to measure things in points, but back then points were pixels, so same thing. And if you wanted to put views on the screen, you could kind of just do it statically. Just put it at a position 1010 or 210, 370, and it would work, and you didn't care because the screen would never change size, right? I mean, if you were a real go-getter, if you were trying to live your life in advanced mode, sure, you could do to a type of adaptive layout using auto resizing constraints and springs and struts to kind of pin your objects to the sides of the view. But no one has time for that. We did have to support, optionally we could support landscape mode, which is kind of a different screen size, right? I mean, it's turned on its side, it's different dimensions. But really, from my memory and code I saw back then, people just wrote code like, if portrait, do this layout. If landscape, do this other layout. It was still kind of statically treated as just another special case. This situation was 5 years, the first 5 iPhones and 4 iPod Touches, exactly one screen size. The iPhone 4 was Retina, which doubled the pixel resolution, but the layout size was the same. And it was nice, right? You could just not worry about different screen dimensions, just put the views exactly where you wanted them. Whereas over in the world of Android, oh my gosh, all their different devices, all the different screen sizes, what a nightmare. And we would just point and laugh at how good we had it. 2010, of course, we did have the iPad, which was a new screen size, but again, we considered this more of a different type of device, right? And again, code bases, if iPad, do this layout. If iPhone, do this other layout. Again, still kind of a static approach. It wasn't until 2012, the iPhone 5 was the first iPhone with a different screen size, but it was the same width, just a little bit taller. So then if you were one of those go-getters who were using springs and struts, your life was a little bit easier. But the rest of us tried to keep up a little bit. It was around this time that maybe the Android guys were laughing at us because they're like, people, we figured this out years ago. What are you guys doing with all your special case code? In 2012, Apple introduced auto layout, which was a new way of specifying positioning your views. Instead of positioning them explicitly, you would use constraints to do so. Auto layout was very powerful, very useful, but also very hard to use. And those of you who were back then, if you recognize this, you know what I'm talking about. But the rest of us, trust me, it's just evidence of kind of the auto layout pain. iOS 8 came in 2014, and Apple really started pushing for what they were calling adaptive layouts. They were saying, hey people, your code should stop caring about orientation, portrait versus landscape. Your code should stop caring about what kind of device it's on. All you should care about is your app is running in a container frame of some size and shape, and you should lay out your stuff accordingly. This is when they introduced the concept of size classes, which was kind of a broad indicator of like, is the container compact like an iPhone or big like an iPad? But it was still, you were supposed to do it in a very flexible way. Those of us paying attention took this as a big hint, like we should probably start doing this, and it turned out to be true because later that year is when Apple introduced the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, which were the first 2 iPhones to have, not first 2, which had different screen sizes from the iPhone 5 series, as well as 2 different screen sizes from each other. It was really around this time that I think everyone kind of said, I need to take all these static layout stuff in my code base, all these special cases, and really kind of embrace auto layout and the more flexible layout styles. 2015, iPad introduced multitasking, which lets you have multiple apps side by side on the same screen, or in slide over. And this is another example, right? Like in slide over mode, your app was tall and skinny like an iPhone size, but it was running on an iPad. So you better not have any code in there that says if iPad as far as the layout goes. And of course, now we have Swift UI, which has kind of this adaptive layout built into it, right? It's actually harder in Swift UI to explicitly put something at a certain coordinate, right? They made it really hard to do the wrong thing. And now there's too many size devices to count. I actually thought it'd be cool to try to count all the possible sizes, and I failed. So it are too many sizes to count. Yeah, because nowadays, I don't know if you guys noticed, but a new iPhone will be released, and it will actually be like 4 points wider than the previous model. No one notices, no one pays attention because we've all adapted our code to deal with kind of any reasonable size. Moving back to the main timeline. We're going to leave the Stone Age and move on to the Middle Ages, 2010. 2010, iOS 4 was released, finally, not iPhone OS. The iPad had just come out earlier that year, so they finally decided to give it a name that could encompass both, although it's ironic because now we have iPad OS specifically for the iPad, and iPhone is still iOS, so I don't know, Apple can't plan ahead, although I hate saying iPhone OS, so I'm very happy either way. Apple introduced multitasking. This was a bit of a change for developers. Before this, your app was either on screen running or it was completely not on screen, not running. Multitasking added new modes we had to handle, like in the background running, in the background suspended, but it was worth the trade-off because lots of new capabilities. 2010 also is when the iPhone 4 was announced, which was the first Retina iPhone. Again, Retina was doubling the resolution in every dimension, like basically making the pixel density twice as dense or 4 times as dense, depending on whether you're talking about linear or anyways. This was a little bit of disruptive to developers because we were all expected to now include Retina quality image assets in our apps, which we didn't see this coming, right? So you might have had some image in your app that you had done in Photoshop at the exact right dimensions, right? And now you have to do a double dimension version, or maybe you licensed a third-party icon pack, and that person who did that is long gone, and now you need to come up with these higher resolution icons. So a little bit disruptive there, a little bit of a scramble, but now everyone kind of plans for being able to have icons of any resolution. 2010, Xcode 4 was announced. I told you this is the first version that included Interface Builder built into it. I believe this was kind of a bit of a rewrite as a whole, a bit of a rewrite as a whole for Xcode. It kind of forms the basis of modern Xcode today. There was a long beta period. It was announced in, I think in WWDC 2010, but wasn't officially released until March. Moving on to 2013, iOS 7. I believe iOS 7 is the single most disruptive thing to happen to developers all at once, even since that point. iOS 7 completely changed the way that the entire operating system looked, from the home screen to the apps. Apps previously had what we called the skeuomorphic look, which with gradients and shadows and textures and looking like real physical objects. We moved to this flat, planar style. And regardless of what you think of this aesthetically, everyone's entitled to their opinions. The fact is that pretty much overnight after iOS 7 was released, if you had an app that looked like the old style, it was considered old and crusty and out of date by everyone, and your users would immediately tell you that and demand that you make your app look much more boring. If you had developed your app using standard controls, like this is Apple's Mail app, then it wasn't too hard to port. But if you had painstakingly embraced the skeuomorphic look and and hand-did textures on a pixel-by-pixel basis, you probably had to kind of redesign the whole app. And so very, very disruptive. We all made it to the other end. Hopefully nothing like that will happen. Again, because the problem was it wasn't the amount of changes, but it was like overnight, from this to this. There wasn't really like a time period in which you could kind of ease into it. Moving on to 2014. iOS 8 introduced app extensions. This was really important because before this, your app was just running in its own process entirely. This allowed your code to be running in other little mini processes so it can interface more with the operating system or with other apps. They introduced some types of extensions at the time. Now there's like dozens more. But this really formed the basis of all of Apple's being able to add all sorts of functionality in the future, right? This is how we interface with Siri. This is how we get widgets on the home screen, app extensions. Pretty much, I think it's hard to write an app now without at least some app extensions in your app. 2014, also TestFlight, awesome. TestFlight is a tool for doing beta testing. It was a third-party tool, but then it was bought by Apple, and Apple re-released it in 2014. Before this, if you wanted to have a public beta of your app, it was a huge pain. All that certificate signing, provisioning profile stuff I told you before, you had to deal with that on a user-by-user basis, getting their UUID from their device and all this stuff. It was such a pain, it essentially was barely worth it. TestFlight changed everything. It made it easy for developers. It made it easy for users. And it really brought public beta testing to the masses in the world of iOS. 2014, there's something else I forgot. Oh yeah, Swift, you may have heard of it. Anvil. Swift, a brand new programming language meant to be used for all of Apple platforms, iOS, Mac, etc. It brought us a modern syntax, it brought us things like type safety, and it brought us endless arguments on the Swift evolution forums about pointless programming language minutia. But I'm not bitter. Moving on to 2019, Catalyst was introduced, which was a port of UIKit for macOS, because if you were an iOS developer before this and you wanted to build a Mac version of your iOS app, you pretty much had to change all of your UIKit code to AppKit code and kind of have mostly a separate code base probably. Catalyst let you take your existing iOS app and turn it into a Mac app with what Apple claimed was a single button press. You know, a little bit more to it than that, I think we all know. But more interestingly, Swift UI was also introduced in 2019, which entirely new way of developing UI, a declarative syntax instead of imperative. I think most developers are very happy about Swift UI, even if it has some rough edges. I think most people really want to use it as much as possible. And it was kind of cross-platform from the beginning, right? iOS, iPadOS, macOS, tvOS, watchOS, visionOS. Did I get them all? Did I get them all? I think I did. So that brings us to the modern age. But this is a history talk, so modern age we're not going to cover, maybe in 10 years. I have no idea why I use Baby Yoda for the modern age, actually. I was doing this talk, I was doing it for my wife, and she suggested it, and I thought that's cool. Everyone loves Grogu, so, you know. Yeah. But before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about the future. After all, you know, we think we're there on the timeline, but in 20 years, you know, we'll still be in the Stone Ages, right? As far as, and hopefully we'll all be doing apps, building apps in 20 years, you know, wish everyone good health. So you might be asking, what's going to happen in the future? Like, what's the future going to be like? Well, or I like to think of it as, what are the things that are going to be important to iOS app development in the future? And so to answer that question, or at least give my opinion of that, I started thinking about, what are the things that have been important to iOS app development throughout the whole history of it? What are the things that, despite all the changes to APIs and new App Store rules and new devices, what are the things that have consistently remained important? And so the first one I came up with is creating awesome apps, right? Even back when everything was super limited APIs, lots of restrictions, we didn't focus on the limitations, we focused on making cool apps. Secondly, trying new opportunities. Every new version of iOS has new APIs that let us add new features to our apps, and in a lot of cases, even entirely new types of apps that we couldn't make before. And they're constantly giving us new opportunities for business models and things. And I think we've seen over time developers who kind of embrace this and jump in and try new things can find success. And third, making your own luck. We've seen the case, you know, a developer writes an app and we say, oh my God, it was so successful. It was the right app at the right time, seen by the right people, you know, the right people at Apple, the right people in the press. I think it's the kind of luck that you can steer yourself into, right? You can kind of look at what's going on and decide what would be the right app to build at this time, or what would be the right app that I could pitch in the right way to get the right people to see it. So I think you can make your own luck. So these are the things that I think are worth continuing to focus on. Don't get me wrong, we can all get excited about new APIs and new frameworks and things, but I think this is the thing that's really will really continue to carry you forward as you build apps. And so that brings me to the end. You can contact me on Mastodon at KabukiVision at mastodon.social. This URL is a little shared Dropbox folder I have, which has some of the very early SDK documentation if you want to read that. It also has a copy of a PDF of that comic book of the app review guidelines, which is really cool. So check that out. I hope everyone has a great Dev World and X World. I'm really excited about it. And if I haven't met you, which I think there's a lot of people I haven't, please come up and say hi. I'd love to get to know you. Thanks. Yeah. If people want questions, do we have time?
We've got time. We've got time for a few questions. Anyone got anything for Adam? How good was that?
Thanks, Adam. And what was your favorite time in that history period?
Just the first year, I'd say. My first app didn't make the App Store on day one. It wasn't released until November of 2008, and it was a year later that I was doing well enough that I could conceivably decide to quit my day job, and that's when I did that. And yeah, it was just a time when I don't know, when you meet other developers, there was just nothing but enthusiasm, nothing but just excitement about, like, it was just cool and noteworthy to be making apps. So, you know, nowadays I tell people I make apps and they just, you know, say, oh, that's fine. And they change the subject and ask me what my wife does for a living. She studies shark brains. It's actually a lot cooler. So that's fine.
What would you say was Apple's biggest misstep in the whole app, iOS, iPhone OS process?
You're going to get me in trouble. No, you mean besides forcing us to let our iPhone apps run on iPad? Gosh, I thought I had prepared for some questions. Biggest misstep. Oh God. The Apple Map stuff. I don't know. I don't know if it's a. You know, there were different things happened that at times made us grumpy, like the iOS 7 transition or the Apple Maps. Nowadays, those things seem like, oh, that, you know, it was. They don't seem. I don't categorize them as huge missteps. I don't know. I'll think about that a little bit, and I'll have to give you a better answer. But yeah, sorry, I don't have something off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think it was similar to what they were asking. What was the most painful, thing that you encounter in your whole career?
I mean, I do remember the iOS 7 transition being specifically painful because I had an app. My first app was an app called Notemaster, and the first version of it was very just all the stock controls just looked very like that typical iOS look. And a few years in, I decided I needed to make it look beautifully textured and skeuomorphic, and I worked really hard on that over the course of like 6 months, and I finally released it, and I think it was like within the next 6 months is when iOS 7 was announced, and I just, it was terrible timing. No one could, I think we all knew that a change was coming with iOS 7, but I don't think we knew how extreme it would be all of a sudden.
So on that note, iOS 7 was a little while ago now. We might be due for another reflattening pretty soon. There's always these rumors about coalescing the new design language of Vision OS of iOS. That might happen. If there was another reflattening, what would you like to see iOS look like?
So you think it's going to go in the more a reflattening, not a because some people say it's going to go back to skeuomorphic. Yeah. Oh, reinflation. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, you do see that. Even since iOS 7, there have been revisions, right? iOS 7, they went really far in one direction, and I like how over time they've done. I like rounded rectangles, so they've done a lot more with that, and like the modal sheets now have they work better, look nicer, things like that. That you sometimes see them introduce some new thing in a single app, like the music app or the Maps app, and then over time everything kind of adopts that. So. I don't know. The Vision OS stuff is really cool. I mean, the frosted glass is cool, but I don't know if you guys have had a chance to actually try a Vision Pro, but the frosted glass looks like 100 times cooler when you're actually wearing it. Like it's almost so. I almost think like it's designed specifically for that. And if it came to iOS, I mean, I can't imagine how it would work. But I mean, I guess there's always been glass blurs in iOS. I don't know. I don't know.
All right, we're going to
What do you think?
I definitely think we could start seeing, like, Apple like doing this thing where, like, now there's like subtle shades of grey and then like white floor and stuff. You could start having a little bit of that Beverly effective vision.
Yeah. Okay, and that does bring it's kind of a little bit of unflattening, a little bit of a thickness. Yeah. I do like that since they've introduced a little bit more shadows since iOS 7. Not extreme, but just enough, just to make things stand out a little bit.
We're going to have 2 more questions. I got Tom here, and I saw Quentin with his hand up, and then we'll let you have time for the toilet.
So obviously at the start of this process, nobody had iPhones. Was there a sense in the early days that you were working for a limited audience initially, and then was there a time when it's like, wow, this is mainstream now?
So we had iPhones. I mean, iPhones were out for a full 9 months before the SDK. So we had some sense that this device already existed, and we had them in our hands. Just personal anecdote, I felt like it was the second iPhone, the 3G, that's when I started noticing my friends at work who are not Apple nerds getting iPhones. And I think, at least in the US, which is where I lived at the time, a lot of that had to do with, I think they made it cheaper. They then had it subsidized by the carriers. So something that went from like a $700 device, all of a sudden was like a $100 or $200 device. But don't get me wrong, like even the first early days of the App Store, when there was only one iPhone, I mean, there was enough market for app developers to be successful. There was no concerns about we need things to get bigger. There was just fewer apps to compete with, so you could still get, I don't know how, I was gonna say you could still get millions of downloads. I actually have no idea how many iPhones there were out around that time, so I'm kind of making it up, but yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing back all those repressed memories that I need to get therapy for, especially signing. I just wondered if you had any funny stories or relay, like people coming up to you on the street, knowing you're an app developer, pitching you bad app ideas.
Oh my God. Yes. Probably everyone that was developing apps back then remember. Yes, that was, again, there was like an app mania going on of sorts. People were excited about apps. It was novel just to have apps. And I think a lot of us experienced, anytime you told someone you're an app developer, the very first thing they'd say is, oh, I have a cool app idea. Let me tell you about it. And in my experience, at least, I'd say, let's say, half the time they pitch something that you simply couldn't do, right? Because back then the APIs were very limited, so it would be something that would require multitasking or something, and so you would just say, oh, that's not possible, And the other half of the time, it was something that there was a very obvious app that already did that, and then maybe like 1% of the time they'd be like, oh, that's actually a cool idea. Thank you for giving that to me for free. So.
Did you still get it? Did anyone ask you?
Not really. Yeah. I mean, now I beg my friends for ideas. I don't know if you've seen it. There was around the time there was a comedy video about an app called the App, which man, I wish we could look it up real quick. It was basically like a joke, like, oh, we have an app for telling you whether your app idea is bad. And so someone would say like, an app that teaches you how to tie your shoelaces, and it would say bad, or like, that already exists. There was like, the funniest one was like Instagram, but for pictures of your dogs, and it would say that's still Instagram, So it was making fun of like the whole culture of these bad ideas. So yeah, search for the App on YouTube if you want to see that. I still chuckle at that whenever I look it up. So.
Hey, so I got to let you know a secret. It was my idea to suggest Adam as a keynote for this, so I'm sure you will all agree I am very, very good at selecting keynote speakers, right? So big hand for Adam. That was great. Really well.
Thank you.